Hello, everyone, and welcome to this ECPR House Series Roundtable on Electoral Integrity and Disinformation in an Era of Democratic Backsliding. The Roundtable is meant to take stock of recent developments in electoral democracy across the continent of Europe, and it brings together experts with country-specific knowledge of elections that are taking place across the continent to discuss challenges such as disinformation, foreign interference, and institutional threats to democratic elections. The roundtable is going to explore strategies to safeguard electoral processes and strengthen democratic resilience. After a brief moment where I introduce our speakers for today, I'll then turn things over to the first speaker, Dr. Cristina Chiva, who's from the University of Salford, Manchester. Dr. Chiva is a lecturer in EU politics at the University of Salford. She's a specialist in the comparative politics of gender, political representation, and democratic institutions in Central and Eastern Europe. Today, she's going to be talking to us about recent developments in Romania. Hugo Lopes is a PhD candidate at ICS, University of Lisbon, and he'll be talking to us about recent electoral developments in Portugal. He'll be followed by Aleš Michal, who's a PhD candidate at Charles University in Prague, who's going to be speaking to us about developments in Czechia. The final speaker in the roundtable will be Dr. Sarah, who's a lecturer in quantitative political science at Queen's University Belfast, and she'll be talking to us about the recent election in Germany. This will all be then discussed by Professor Aleks Szczerbiak from the University of Sussex, who is an expert on Polish politics and will be speaking in reflection on the topics of what's been discussed by other speakers, as well as putting this into context of the most recent electoral development in the European continent, which is the presidential elections in Poland. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks very much to our panelists for giving us their time and their expertise on these topics. I'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A function for the discussion afterwards, so please hold your questions until that time. And with this, I turn it over to Dr. Cristina Chiva to speak to us about the recent electoral developments in Romania. Please, Cristina, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank ECPR in general and Jonathan for the invite. It's really, really nice to be in such wonderful company today. I will try to be as brief as possible, although I have a rather lengthy story to tell, which is going to probably have to be abridged as much as possible. 2024 was a bumper year for elections in Romania. There were local and European Parliament elections in the summer, and then parliamentary and presidential elections in the autumn and winter. This is unusual. Some of these elections normally run on a 5-year cycle and others on a 4-year cycle, so it was simply a coincidence that all of them happened in the same year. The overarching context was characterized by disenchantment with the major political parties, most notably the communist successor Social Democrats, the Party of Social Democracy, and also the National Liberal Party, who had dominated Romanian politics for the better part of the period since the turn of the millennium. A third contender, the Save Romania Union, which was established in 2016, was at the time the third most important player in parliamentary politics. However, what is really important to note, and I think this is what my talk will focus on primarily, is the rise of the far right, which I'm sure other speakers will also emphasize in their own national contexts. Specifically, we have the rise of the Alliance for the Union of Romanians, which first made it into parliament in 2020. They were formed in 2019. Since 2008, far-right parties had been absent from the Romanian parliament. So this was a novel and notable development. And eventually, in the 2024 parliamentary elections, the alliance doubled their share of the vote from 9% in 2020 to 18% in 2024. And this is under circumstances where all of the other parties ended up with a decreased vote share in the 2024 elections by comparison to 2020. What I would like to focus on specifically is the presidential elections, because this is where the themes of this roundtable come across most clearly. disinformation and electoral integrity. And I think in order to understand the presidential elections, we need to look at this as a story in three acts. The first one occurred in October of 2024 when the Constitutional Court disqualified Diana Szczerbiak, a very controversial, and that's an understatement, candidate for the presidency, with all sorts of rather radical positions on a variety of things. The Constitutional Court highlighted the anti-democratic and anti-Semitic narratives that she was sort of pushing in her run to become a presidential candidate. Her efforts to sort of dismantle the constitutional foundations of the Romanian state. And also, if one reads the Constitutional Court decision, clearly there is quite a lot about her links to Russia, which is unusual in a Romanian context. Romania has historically not been Russia-friendly. And of course, the overall national security context is very sensitive because Romania shares a very long border with Ukraine. And it is sort of in a very, very sensitive geographical position in this context. It was unusual to have a candidate with close links to Russia. Make of this what you want. Legal commentators have highlighted that it's not entirely clear that the court was within its constitutional mandate in terms of this decision. However, this was the decision, and Szczerbiak was disqualified. She's currently an MEP. The second act occurred in December of 2024, when the first round of the elections happened, and we ended up in a situation where in between the 14 candidates running and a very, very split vote, the two top candidates ended up being from none of the major political parties, which again illustrates just how disenchanted the voters were. And instead, the top candidate, Călin Georgescu, was virtually unknown. He was independent, and he got about 21% of the vote. The second candidate, Elena Lasconi, was viewed generally as progressive, although some questioned her political experience because she only had she had only been elected locally, had never held a national mandate. This came as a surprise, and as soon as it came as a surprise, all sorts of dubious practices emerged in the elections, most notably Georgescu's use of the social media, especially TikTok, his tendency to breach electoral law, in the sense that he was told off for not signposting his campaign material as required by Romanian electoral legislation. He chose to say that he was persecuted by the Central Electoral Bureau, who was trying to enforce the relevant electoral legislation. There was some issue with electoral fraud because he did not declare his campaign expenditure properly. He declared zero campaign expenditure under circumstances where there were posters with him, which must have been paid by someone. There was a lot of activity on the social media as well that favored Georgescu, and again, it was completely unclear who had paid for all of this. In the event, after about a week of extreme turbulence in Romanian politics, the Constitutional Court declared that it could not validate the results of the elections, which is what it is required to do by the Constitution, and that we would need to do it again, which was unprecedented in Romanian politics and created a full-blown constitutional crisis for a while. The third act, which I'm coming to finally, is that of 2025, where once again we had Szczerbiak, originally, who had been disqualified by the Constitutional Court, Georgescu, who was also extreme right or far right. We could discuss the precise classification in the first trial of the elections, And then in the third run, we have the contest between George Simeon, who represented the Alliance for the Union of Romanians, and a progressive independent candidate, Nicu Șordan, who eventually won. So essentially, I would say that what happened is that there was a great deal of electoral mobilization against blocking the far right in the second round of the presidential elections in 2025. In sum, I think that this particular story exposed a number of issues in Romania. On the one side, one would be tempted to say, okay, this is an all's well when it ends well kind of story. In the end, we were successful in beating back the rise of the far right in presidential elections, not once but 3 times in a row. On the other hand, I would really qualify the optimism. Yes, many institutions were involved in trying to figure out what was happening and to maintain a certain level of electoral integrity, the Constitutional Court, the Central Electoral Bureau, the government as well in between the 2 rounds of the elections, and also eventually the electorate. However, I would say that these elections highlighted a number of issues. Some of them have to do with the use of the social media by the presidential candidates, not just Georgescu, but others as well, and a tendency to flout electoral regulations. Another set of issues that was highlighted was weaknesses in the enforcement of electoral campaign laws, because it turned out to be extremely difficult to enforce them properly, especially if you have a candidate who does not appear particularly bothered by non-compliance. The lack of clarity about who was doing what and who had the power to block which part of or fix which part of the issues that were arising, I think was really, really important. And the final issue that I think came out of this, which is also important, is the national security aspect, which I think in a sense democracies are pretty ill-equipped to handle within the current institutional design because of the general lack of transparency of what the intelligence services do. In the event then President Iohannis had to declassify some of the secret service reports in order to persuade the electorate that there was something not quite right with the December 2024 elections. And of course, the issue of foreign interference. There has been, to the best of my knowledge, no definite proof of Russian interference, although there is really good circumstantial evidence of interference by someone who was very keen on having these far-right candidates elected. The final issue that I think this highlights is the growing distance between voters in the diaspora and voters who are living in the country, because the diaspora voted overwhelmingly for the far-right candidate in 2025, and this represents a concern. It might well tie in to the use of social media to reach voters abroad. So I hope that I have been reasonably on time, and thank you for listening.
Wonderful.
And I'm looking forward to all the questions.
Excellent and very stimulating first intervention. Thank you so much, Cristina. Now we turn over to Hugo, who's going to tell us a bit about recent developments in Portuguese politics. Hugo, please, the floor is yours.
Sorry, can you see my presentation?
It looks very nice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I will talk about Portugal's third general election in just 3 years. The election was 3 weeks ago. There's not so much about this information so far, but I will try the best as I can to cover it also. But there's nothing about foreign interference. So just let's start. The center-right achieved government last year after 8 years of socialist terms. Luís Montenegro's minority government relied on support from other parties to pass legislation. However, the government fell after 11 months into office. The Spinum Viva scandal broke earlier this year. It was a consultancy co-founded by the Prime Minister that continued receiving money from firms with business before the state. This story raised several ethical concerns. While the Prime Minister denied wrongdoing, he failed to contain the fallout, and as he was facing calls of parliamentary inquiry, the government submitted a confidence vote, which was rejected by the opposition in parliament, leading to the elections 3 weeks ago. We went to elections knowing, taking data from the Eurobarometer, that citizens consider the crisis in the national healthcare system and the housing system, as well as the economy, including inflation and rising costs of living, as the main issues the country is facing. The first two stand out well above European average, while, for example, despite increased salience recently, immigration is still below European average. And during the campaign, parties were largely responsive to the voters' concerns. The main issues under debate were government ethics and corruption, including the scandal related to the Prime Minister, and also over the Socialist Party leader real estate dealings, which were also a scandal during the campaign due to a public prosecution investigation on the PS leader. The national health care, education, housing crisis, immigration, and also, to a lesser extent, European defense, government stability and alliance policy, energy policy, and justice reform. Regarding disinformation, about 70% of citizens reported concerns about digital disinformation's impact on elections. A recent report shows that the far right spreads disinformation to question democratic institutions the same way as Vox does in Spain. The tactic is mostly the same, centered around electoral fraud, claims about immigrant crime, and corruption allegations against the other opponents, other party leaders, for example, and the government in particular. The far-right party, Chega, also leveraged a lot of bot activity on X. It is estimated that more than half of accounts engaging Chega on X were fake. In Portugal, unlike Spain, for example, which has a lot of legal penalties, we rely more on monitoring. So fact checkers contributed a bit to debunk these claims, but of course, this type of disinformation is widespread and difficult to control. This is highly important because the far-right leader's presence on the media is high. Another report shows that André Ventura, Chega's leader, is now one of the most frequent special guests on Portuguese television, and some journalists describe themselves as being the armed wing of Chega. They recognize they are amplifying its message compared to other parties, further contributing to the growing normalization of far right. I must stress that Chega was created only 6 years ago, 3 elections ago. Until then, Portugal was the exception in the European context to far right rise. Now I will try to walk you through the main results with the few data we have from the elections so far. Comparing the expectations against the outcome of the elections, this figure shows voting intentions for political parties across public opinion polls. Until recently, polls showed a race too close to call between the socialist and the center-right coalition. Similarly, the radical right appeared more or less slightly below or roughly about the same as its previous result last year. The electoral results of last year and this year are in the vertical lines. And in the end, the center-right coalition indeed secured the plurality with 32% of the vote, but still falling short of a majority. The communists dropped, the left overall dropped a lot, and the liberal right just had a moderate rise from last year. The big story, however, is about the radical right and the socialists. The radical right overtook the long dominant Socialist Party to become the largest opposition force in parliament for the first time. Polls failed to predict the gap between the socialists and the radical right. Although Chega was slightly below the socialists in terms of vote share, they surpassed the socialists in terms of seat share, winning 60 seats. With 24% of the vote, while the socialists won two less than Chega. This is the end of 5 decades of two-party dominance, and I stress again that Chega was created only 6 years ago. And for the first time in history, the combined share of votes of the center-right and center-left parties falls below 2/3 of parliament in terms of seats. And André Ventura, now being the leader of the largest parliamentary party other than the government, becomes officially the leader of opposition in parliament. In sum, a party founded just 6 years ago surged from a political fringe to holding roughly a quarter of all parliamentary seats. I mean, while if we compare the number of the effective number of parties from last election 1 year ago to now, we can see that this election does not appear to significantly alter the fragmentation of the party system. If anything, the effective number of parties decreased a bit, despite being on the rise for decades. But if we look at the combined vote share of the two main parties, the center-left and the center-right, the data confirms the end of the two-party system as anticipated in the previous election last year. So in the last 2 elections, the top 2 parties recorded some of the weakest results they have had in history, and the combined seat share dropped below 2/3 for the first time. This downward trend was already visible, of course, last year, but now this does not appear to be a short-term fluctuation. These figures show the evolution of vote share and seat share of the two main parties over the last 26 years, comparing with the radical right in blue. We can see that, as I was saying, Chega rose from 1.3% to 24% in 3 elections, matching the second most voted party. And of course, this makes André Ventura officially a candidate for prime minister. Being the leader of opposition, it has a protocol in terms of Portuguese legislation that gives him time, space, and more control over parliamentary speeches, so far and so on, seats, so far, although also visibility and stature. In terms of geography, the radical right in blue is stronger among rural voters who often feel neglected, as the recent study shows, and for that reason they tend to vote more for far right. These are former left-wing strongholds of the communists or the socialists. And if we compare not only which party won in each municipality, if we look at the differences at the party level compared to the previous election, you see that the center-right won votes in almost every municipality, whereas the radical right, in pink in this graph, won 60 municipalities, around 20% of municipalities, as we have seen in the previous slide, but won votes in almost every municipality across the country, whereas the socialists suffered loss across everywhere on the mainland. Now, just briefly walking you through transfers of votes. Recent analysis shows that the center-right won votes more from the center-left, the far-right, and other parties, blank and null votes. The center-left lost to the far-right, to the center-right, and to the abstention, while the far-right had net gains from the center-left, others blanks and null votes, and some small net losses to the center-right. Finally, in terms of demographics, and just briefly walking you through this, These plots show the probability of voting for each of the three main parties, the center-right, the center-left, and the far-right. In this case, by gender, woman in red. And we can see that more men vote far-right, as elsewhere in Europe, more women vote center-left, and that the gender gap is narrow, among the center-right, which has improved its performance among women. Generally speaking, the gender gap remains stable in Portugal, with the exception of the center-right coalition, the main coalition among the center-right. Women tend to lean left, while men lean right, as in many other countries. In terms of age, the center-right is increasingly popular among older voters, while the center-left is losing support across all age groups, but especially among older cohorts, which were the main basis of support of the socialists in the country and still are, as we can see, but the losses are bigger compared to other age groups. While the far right is growing in all age groups, although older voters remain more resistant to voting for the far right. Overall, and considering also parties not shown in these plots, young voters are more likely to support new parties, while older voters tend to favor conventional parties such as the socialists, the center-right, and the communists. Finally, education. The center-right remains stable, with stronger support among university-educated voters. The center-left is losing support across all education levels, but especially among the least educated, while the far-right is growing in all groups, but support remains lower among university-educated voters. Just to conclude, Luís Montenegro remains prime minister with another minority government. He still refuses a coalition with the far right, maintaining the cordon sanitario, but is reliant on piecemeal deals to pass legislation. He is dependent on the socialists, the far right, or smaller parties to pass budgets and laws. The far right now leads the opposition, which gives them a lot of advantages in terms of protocol and legislation to gain control and seats in parliamentary committees, for example. And there is a risk of continued instability, which may lead us to another slap election if the government fails. Thank you, and I hope I am on time.
Rather close. Thank you for the concise and informative overview of the recent Portuguese elections. We now turn it over to Aleš for the discussion of Czechia. 10-minute overview of recent electoral developments there. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I try to share my screen. So can you hear my slides, please?
Yes, we see your slides. They look great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. When I was thinking about my today's speech, I found a story. Yeah, because unlike in Germany, in Poland, in Romania, and in Portugal, we still wait for our national elections this year because we will have them in this fall. So my presentation will be quite different, and will be about upcoming elections and the story where overlap all for us relevant stuff. So democratic backsliding, disinformation, and electoral integrity. And this story names postal voting and the Czech debate about postal voting. Yeah, where we are. The simple answer to this question is we are in the middle of campaign before the elections. So we witness the contest of political parties and the clash between former prime minister who was defeated in latest national elections. So Andrej Babiš here wearing his Trumpist hat. And on the other side is current Prime Minister Petr Fiala leading anti-populist coalition, which won the latest national elections. In this campaign, we focus mainly on economic issues and on quite bizarre Bitcoin scandal of Minister of Justice, who received money in Bitcoin. So this electronic stuff, and who resigned 2 weeks ago. So it all impact has its own impact to this campaign. And what is the most important and what frames the campaign and the Czech political landscape of recent years is the cleavage between populism and anti-populism. So in the latest elections 4 years ago, there was a main clash between populist bloc led by Andrej Babiš, so Andrej Babiš and radical right. And on the other side, anti-populist coalitions, which won the elections. But what is quite specific for the Czech case and where overlap all the relevant topics for us is that the Czech Republic still hasn't postal voting. So in this campaign and in the middle of this campaign, we solve this problem. So the upcoming elections, for the first time, the Czech Republic will allow postal voting for citizens living abroad. It is quite interesting in the context of the Central European region, because almost all countries in Central and Eastern Europe already have some form of this voting. Also in Slovakia, where is really strongly populist government. Also in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, and in all countries where the elections were recently. And for the Czech Republic, it is now something new. Why we lag behind? There was and is a significant gap between party supply and citizens' demands. Not only in this context, but the Czech society is relatively progressive and open to changes, but the political supply has been long-standing, more moderate, more conservative in many political issues. For example, the majority of the Czech society wants euro currency, but the consensus of political parties after the fall of communism was really cold in this stuff, and leading political parties didn't accept this demand from their voters. So we have a paradoxical situation where, for example, voters of leading anti-populist parties, Civic Democratic Party, voters are in favor euro, but the party is not strongly in favor in this question. The other reason is the absence of a mobilizing diaspora or ethnic minority who is politically relevant. And the third reason, really relevant in this context, is the clash between, as David Goodhart noted, between somewheres and anywheres. So the society is divided. Somewheres are people who want stability, security, community. They have less formal education, are more conservative and or nationalist. And anywheres are for open society, for mobility, for and are more like liberal. So this is a clash between somewheres and anywheres, because somewheres will be more nationalist, and anywheres more likely living abroad. From the skeptics to the postal voting in this context lead two relevant sentiments. We can reduce to two important sentences. The first is, we don't need everything other countries have. So it reflects also in euro currency and also in this stuff. Yeah, all the countries in Central and Eastern Europe have the postal voting, but we don't need everything what they have. And the second crucial sentiment, then they don't live with us, so why should they vote here? Yeah, it is around 800,000 people living in abroad, and it is quite a sentiment. It is something like a sentiment or communist legacy of ethnically homogeneous society, where people living abroad were outsiders and not politically so relevant for our politics. So the debate about postal voting is really framed from the side of skeptics. It's really framed from these two crucial claims. Yeah, we witness an increase of populism, and I already mentioned the clash between populism and anti-populism. And populists use these arguments for their framing postal voting as something elitist, because for them, we, the people, live here in the Czech Republic, and they live abroad. Surely there are also some international triggers. Not only the American elections, where Donald Trump thought that the elections were stolen, but also the European case for 4 years before about cancelled runoff in Austria, where the postal voting still played a role, and of course, COVID pandemic and its impact on increasing number of people voted by post globally. The Czech debate about the postal voting is politicized and is quite sick due to the style of populist arguments and the frame which arises from the claim which bloc would most likely benefit from the accepting or approving of postal voting. So it can be current government because their supporters are more likely anywhere who would live abroad. And actually, how many people will vote abroad? It is also the relevant questions which is in the middle of this debate. The last thing what I would like to mention is the public perception of this topic. 54% of Czechs fear that postal voting could lead to the electoral manipulation. It is majority of society, but from my point of view, it includes not only anti-system supporters or supporters of anti-system and populist parties, but also those who don't believe elections due to the possibility of manipulation from Russia. So this group of people who don't trust to the elections due to the post voting. It includes really heterogeneous groups of people, and it is important to know this fact. Key takeaways from my introductory speech: strong democratic institutions and relatively low polarization. That's the Czech context. Yeah, it is important to know because we have bicameralism, we have a strong constitutional court. It is important that it is the landscape of the Czech Republic. And manipulation with the elections would require massive coordination, given the decentralization in the process of vote counting. So it is also important. It is mostly impossible to manipulate counting votes to this level. So it is also important to know. However, this trust runs deep and unites quite moderate and radical critics of institutions, populist, anti-system politicians, and their supporters. And it is quite warning in the Czech debate. And we will see what brings the approval of postal voting. But I think it's important to note that it is for the Czech Republic something new, and it mirrors some crucial debates between populism and anti-populism. Thank you.
Many thanks, Aleš. Now we pivot to Czechian neighbor, Germany, and we're very fortunate to have Dr. Sarah Wagner, whose expertise on radical left parties in particular will be an interesting thing to hear about in the context of the recent German election. Sarah, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, John, for organizing all of this, and thanks for having me. Yeah, I'll talk a bit about Germany. I'll try and keep it short so we can have loads of discussions about it. But for ages, basically, and still now, Germany's kind of been seen as a really good example of a functioning democracy in Europe. But that image is slightly being tested at the moment. So in Germany, we're facing a mix of challenges. We are facing political fragmentation through new parties, such as the left conservative Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht that just came on the scene. We see the continued rise of the far right with the AfD, and we see growing disinformation campaigns that are also happening internally and from abroad. So the 2025 election in Germany really showed this quite clearly. It was a highly unusual snap election. That usually never takes place in Germany, or very rarely takes place. And it happened after the collapse of the three-party progressive government between the Social Democrats, the Green Party. So that collapse and then the subsequent arguments that took place of when would the election actually take place, there were concerns about Germany not having enough paper for the ballots with a few weeks' notice. That caused a lot of sort of questions about maybe the state of some democratic German institutions. And at the heart of what I'm talking about now is really this I think, question that came out through a bunch of these different talks today already, which was how do we really protect electoral integrity when we're living in a time of such severe democratic backsliding? And Germany is an interesting case for this because, like for example, the Electoral Integrity Project has always ranked Germany really highly, and factually, right, Germany is a really stable, strong electoral system. But what is important here is perceptions, right? And perceptions matter sometimes just as much as the procedures. And that's exactly why we see this shift in Germany. The AfD, so Germany's far right or extreme right party, has repeatedly questioned the legitimacy of elections. And there's no evidence behind these claims, right? But that's kind of not the point of their strategy. It really severely plays on this element of distrust, distrust of institutions, distrust of the media, distrust of the elites, distrust of the fact that governmental coalitions have mandates, because the AfD is not invited to join these coalition negotiations. I'll touch on that in a minute. So we kind of clearly see how fragile a lot of these institutions, a lot of this trust is. We saw that in 2021 already. There were Berlin elections and there were really long lines. There were missing ballots and there's general chaos because there was a marathon going on in Berlin at the same time. And all of that led to the Berlin Constitutional Court having to annul the results. And that's super rare, right? But it does show you how easily public confidence can also be shook quite deeply when stuff like that happens. And simultaneously, and it's so nice to hear this from the Czech context as well, there is a rise in absentee voting as well in Germany, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. And especially the AfD has painted some suspicion around that, despite the fact there's incredibly strong security protocols in Germany as well, about when it comes to proxy voting. I vote absentee ballots in Germany, and it is a bureaucratic faff to get that to get to Germany on time. So again, it is not about actual fraud. It's all about feeding into this sort of distrusting narrative, right? If we take a look at the political landscape, on the right, we have the AfD that has built an incredibly strong base in Eastern Germany. And since its inception in the early 2010s, the AfD has radicalized so much over time, so much so that now it's actually classified as confirmed right-wing extremist by Germany's intelligence agency. And yet, despite all the internal chaos of the party, the contradictory positions that they have, and even really openly anti-democratic rhetoric, the party just continues to grow. And there's so many reasons for that, and there's a large literature that is dedicated to understanding this, in part because of frustrations, anger over immigration, Euroscepticism, economic anxieties. But it also really is able to, and this is kind of what I think we might want to talk about later on in the Q&A as well, it's able to really present itself as a true opposition. And it is really able to do that because of the exclusion that takes place. On the other hand, the exclusion is really important to keep electoral integrity stable in Germany. We also have a new player on the scene in Germany, with the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, which is a left conservative party. So a really unique, or a really sort of different party that doesn't really exist that much, especially not in Western Europe. And the party isn't necessarily extremist or anti-democratic, but it definitely uses and appeals to a similar sense of disillusionment as the AfD does. And many of the supporters of the left conservative Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht feel alienated by the immigration policy and also the pandemic restrictions, and just sort of EU bureaucracy more generally. And what's interesting about this new party is that it's taking a sort of very controversial stance on the war in Ukraine. It opposes military support for Kiev and promotes what at least they call a peace-oriented foreign policy. So they frame themselves as quite pacifist. But when you look at a lot of these position points, they really strongly echo a lot of the Russian talking points. So this kind of raises some concerns about the sort of susceptibility of parts of its voter base to general foreign policy or foreign influence more generally, and disinformation, right? So in this context, electoral integrity isn't just about having very secure ballots, but it's also about integrity of political messaging, especially in an age where there is sort of an information warfare happening. And it's also, I think, another really important sign of how fractured the political center has actually become. So the fragmentation really weakens the ability of mainstream parties to form stable, long-lasting coalitions, which then rebuilds trust, right? And that's incredibly dangerous when that's weak, because if the center can't hold, then there is a vacuum that is to be felt. And that brings me to kind of the last point I want to make, or the last topic I want to open in the context of Germany, which is what the Germans call Brandmauer, or a firewall against the right, or what's already been mentioned in the context of Portugal, right? The cordon sanitaire. And for years and years, all democratic parties agreed that there would be no cooperation with a far-right party in Germany. And that means no cooperation with the AfD, no deals, no joint votes, no normalization. But this firewall has officially started to crack. For example, if we just think back to what happened in the beginning of this year, the CDU and the CSU, they proposed a sort of 5-point motion to turn refugees back at Germany's borders. And this motion, highly symbolic, it passed in the Bundestag, and it passed with the help of AfD votes. Officially, it's important to say that there was no signs of there being any sort of backroom kind of deal. But the fact that the CDU, right, accepted AfD support in order to pass a motion is enough to break a really, really substantial political taboo in Germany. And this has not been accepted by everyone, especially the SPD, Green, and most notably Die Linke, the left party leaders. They called this out immediately as a very famous speech by a Linke politician who really called this out and called for people to oppose this and be anti-fascist. And it's important to note this, because if this whole firewall thing starts to crumble, if every party starts to treat the AfD like any other party, then we really risk shifting our entire political conversation to the right, and we risk completely normalizing this party. Importantly, we've seen cooperation with the far right. We have in Germany. This isn't the first time this has happened. It's just the first time this has happened at the national level. So we've seen this at the local level. There's hundreds of documented cases across Germany. It starts with sort of shared votes and motions, and then there's a coalition. And with each step, this gets more normalized. So in 2023, the now chancellor and then just CDU leader Friedrich Merz, he publicly stressed and made a note of the fact that his party needed to form distance to the far-right AfD, which was an important point that he made and it's part of the party's policy. But even in the same breath as he said that, he sort of started walking away and saying that local politics is different from national politics. And he suggested that you need to take a more pragmatic approach at the municipal level, as the AfD is quite present at a lot of these local level meetings and parliaments. And this blurred line, it raises a concern about weakening of this cordon sanitaire between democratic parties and the extreme right. And it raises really important concerns about electoral integrity. There is an important point that might not need to be made about the fact, and that's what I hinted at in the beginning, that excluding the EFD from all sorts of political cooperation might not be the best approach to avoid democratic backsliding. As coalitions between all the democratic members, all the democratic parties start to become larger, they also become more disjointed and less stable. And this in turn can then strengthen the AfD, not least by sort of encouraging them to make the argument that all mainstream parties are similar since they can all work together. In the 2025 election, German election, we saw another chance of this really complicated coalition setup to take place. So there was a pretty high possibility that there would have been another three-party coalition, and that's incredibly unpopular. It's obvious that that would be unpopular. The more people you have deciding what to have for dinner, the more compromises you're going to have to make, and the more weird your dinner situation is going to be. And that's exactly what takes place at the national level as well. This didn't happen, this three-party coalition. It didn't happen because of 10,000 votes. 10,000 votes that the left Conservative Party, BSW, didn't get. So they didn't make it past the 5% threshold by a very, very small amount of votes. If they had, then again, mainstream parties would have had to work within these non-connected coalitions or minority coalitions, which would be even less popular in Germany. So at this point, after this election, the AfD is at over 20% of the vote share. They're a very strong opposition party and the second strongest party in the Bundestag. So what does that mean? Does that mean we need to start being open to possibly breaking down this firewall, or does that mean trying to rebuild it of what's been broken? And that's a really important conversation to have. To what extent can one work with an extremist far-right party? Because they don't want to have a functioning constructive debate. They're not normal opposition. They're something else entirely. I think I've talked for quite a while. I could already go on for a little bit, but I don't want to stop at that. I need 2 more sentences to end on a happy note, because Germany's foundations, they remain really strong, but they are really importantly under pressure. So we need to sort of be able to respond to these very real challenges that exist even within sort of countries and systems where it is maybe not immediately obvious what's taking place.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the provocative and important intervention that draws attention to the stakes in the discussion we're having today. Fortunately, we're joined by Professor Aleks Szczerbiak, who's going to bring to bear his considerable expertise on Euroscepticism, party politics more generally, elections, referendums, and Poland in particular, to summarize the conversation so far. I've given Professor Szczerbiak an extremely broad mandate, perhaps too broad, to cover both the recent electoral developments in Poland as well as the nature of the conversation here. But I really, whatever direction you'd like to take it in, we're all ears. Let me also say to the audience, thanks for your patience. We'll then pivot directly over to question and answer, and there is a Q&A function in the toolbar, which you might be able to access through the More segment if you don't see it in your toolbar already. So just pop your questions in there and then we can move on from that. With this, I turn it over to Professor Szczerbiak, please.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thanks for the kind words of introduction, and thanks to the other speakers who've given really excellent, thoughtful outlines with plenty of food for thought. I'm going to resist the temptation to talk a lot about Poland. If you know me, you'll know that's a great temptation, and it's hard for me to resist that. I will mention it once or twice, and obviously, if anyone's got any specific questions about Poland, obviously, please ask, and I'll be only too happy to answer. But there was so much in those earlier presentations for me to get my teeth into that I'm really mainly, almost exclusively going to focus on those. So a few points which I've kind of thrown together. It's always very difficult trying to gather your thoughts together and listen to what what people are saying in real time, but I'll kind of do my best. I suppose the first sort of overall theme, and this needs to be put front and center really of any discussion, is which a number of the speakers have referred to, is the overall disillusionment, if you like, and mistrust of what you might call, for a better term, the liberal elites. Okay, and by that I mean, the mainstream parties of the centre left, the centre right, the liberal centre, and the challenge that they're facing from political insurgents. Primarily, we're talking about insurgents on the right, which some people call populists. So I think everything we talk about has to be within that context. That is these are the big social forces that are really shaping and reshaping party politics, and in particular countries and across Europe. I think the second thing is, and this is picking up on something that Aleš said, which is, and also Sarah to some extent, I mean, we're not really here talking about kind of straightforward, outright electoral fraud. Okay, I mean, if we were, it's kind of a lot simpler, really. Those ballot boxes were stuffed, or whatever. That miscounting was done. That's a fraudulent election. We rule that out, or whatever. We don't recognise who was elected. We're not talking about that because, as Aleš so correctly pointed out, it's actually very difficult to do that. It requires a very high level of coordination, particularly if you don't control the instruments of the state, which in most countries the insurgent politicians almost by definition don't. What we're talking about are things that are kind of much more messy. They're kind of more difficult. They're things that people kind of seem to feel intuitively, but it's quite difficult to often get a handle on objectively, and that's tricky because that means that a lot of the things that we're doing here are subjective judgments, really. As I say, it would be much simpler if you were just talking about electoral fraud and electoral malpractice. So let's give me an example of that. So an example of that is the use of kind of judicial or kind of regulatory bodies in order to intervene in these processes where there have been perceived to be these kind of malpractices. And the best example of this, obviously, from the presentations we had is in Romania, which Cristina set out very clearly. And I think there are a whole number of very problematic issues that I'd like to raise here. I mean, one is the kind of quite straightforward normative question of, who decides what are acceptable and unacceptable views. Okay. Some of the pretexts that are given for ruling out candidates using either judicial or regulatory bodies, things like, that I've heard, candidates are anti-Semitic, candidates are anti-democratic. Well, who decides who is an anti-democratic candidate, and who decides what are whether anti-Semitic views are acceptable or unacceptable? I mean, to me, they're completely unacceptable. I'm not anti-Semitic in any way, but I'm also not in favour of banning things just because I disagree with them. Okay, and so some of the pretexts that are used raise kind of normative questions, which very often kind of suggest subjective answers. There's also questions of I mean, even putting normative questions aside, there's questions of what you might call effectiveness. Okay, I mean, you can effectively stop somebody from standing by, ruling them out or stopping them in their tracks. But what is the longer term effect by that? And here I come back to my first point, which is about, the struggle, the elite mass struggle, which is the defining issue of politics. Are you not simply reinforcing the idea that this is a ruling elite which is very closely enmeshed, where political, judicial, business, cultural elites, their interests are very closely enmeshed, and simply they are this one branch of this elite is protecting the interests of another branch of the elite? It was interesting, Cristina used the term "all's well that ends well," and in a sense, that's how people could feel. Well, from their point of view, they don't really care how they got there. They are simply it's simply one group of people using the fact that they're very closely connected in a ruling elite with a group of politicians to implement that. And the longer term effect of that is simply to kind of reinforce, you could argue, okay, that liberal elite divide. You also get into lots of other questions, for example, like double standards. Okay, and definition. Okay, I mean, things like foreign interference, disinformation. I mean, what is disinformation? Okay, what counts as disinformation? I remember, I'm old enough to remember when people used the term propaganda, okay, and that was a synonymous, I think, with disinformation. And again, people used propaganda on all sides, but you didn't ban it, basically, and even though you thought what people were saying was a load of rubbish or sometimes lies. It's something you would try and expose in the course of the political contestation process. Or foreign interference. Okay, so again, this raises questions of what foreign interference and of double standards. I mean, the Polish election is a good example of this. So in the Polish election, the supporters of the governing parties drew attention to the fact that Donald Trump supported one of the candidates, and then there was, and also members of the Trump administration, the Republican Party, came out openly and supported the candidate, the insurgent right candidate, and they would say this was foreign interference. At which point, supporters of the insurgent right candidate would say, well, what about German-owned media? Okay, or American-owned media, like one of the main private TV channels, which is not close to Trump, which is close to the liberal left. So again, what foreign interference are we bothered about? And is there not a case that that there's risks of applying double standards here? There's also the question, I think, and this comes back to the kind of elite the mistrust of elite of pretexts. Okay, or of the masses perceiving that you're using some of these things as pretexts. Okay, so for example, the question of national security. Okay, is this not being used? Putin is simply being used as a way of actually banning or preventing the candidates that you find a threat and you disagree with. And again, in the Polish election, there were allegations by the opposition candidate that the security services themselves were being used against the candidate. I mean, obviously, the government completely denies this, but if you're in a context where the masses, lots of people are very, very suspicious of everything that this seemingly interlocked and intertwined liberal elite does, then that's there's a high likelihood that they might believe that, that this is simply the case. You're simply, reductio ad Putin, if you like, rather as opposed to reductio ad Hitler. All your enemies are Putin, and because they're linked with Putin, they're bad. And that simply, again, is potentially ineffective. The other aspect of this, and I suppose this is almost the final one, is social media. And again, this is linked to all kinds of sort of narratives about disinformation. And I think there's a number of things you have to bear in mind here. So I think the first one is the reason that insurgents are so good at using the social media is because they don't have access to the mainstream media in the same way. Okay, and in a sense, the liberal elites, if you want to call them that, have a kind of inbuilt advantage with the mainstream media, which means that they have to access the social media, which forces them to be very good at it. Okay, and as a result, that's very, very frustrating for the liberal centrist elites, because they're not as good at it, and therefore there's a tendency to kind of demonize it. But the problem, of course, is that that's basically if you look at where younger generations are getting their political messaging from, that's where the future of political communication is. And in a sense, there's no point complaining about the fact or that your opponents are much better at it. You simply have to try and play that game much, much better as you can. So again, it looks like you're creating excuses for the fact that you're not very good at competing politically by claiming there's some kind of nefarious forces at risk. And again, lots of stuff about double standards here. Elon Musk, and nobody's talked about this, and actually wasn't a factory in Poland, but but could have been in Germany, for example, which Sarah didn't mention. I mean, people are very keen to mention, Elon Musk's role and the role of social media when it comes down on the side of the insurgent right, but not so keen when social media companies use algorithms, which again, people on the insurgent right will say are actually excluding them. So I think there's a whole kind of series of issues that are raised, and at the core of it, I think, are these two things. And one is overall disillusionment with elites, which we haven't seen for a very, very long time. I'm actually going back into history to try and see how far back you have to go with this, and also where it's going to end. Basically, I'm spending a lot of time looking at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, where you've got very similar processes. Plus the fact that because you're not talking about outright fraud, okay, you're talking about things where there are grey areas, and it's easy for one side to accuse the other side of applying double standards, of simply, shutting down processes because they're losing the argument, or of elites being very closely intertwined and defending each other's interests. Okay, thank you very much.
Many thanks, Aleks.